What is up, guys? PK here. And don't worry, guys, I'm not gonna go full-on philosophy channel on your asses moving forward. But I thought I would do this video whilst yesterday's video was fresh in your memory. Now, for those of you that didn't know, I made a video yesterday outlining some of my arguments for why I don't believe in free will. And I annoyingly ended the video with saying that I also think it's the most compassionate view and that I would do a follow-up video, and I thought I would do that today. Now, firstly, before we get to expanding a little bit onto arguments, I thought I would just address the comments you guys left me directly. So let's start with that. Who's that wonderful chap right there? What a fine-looking gentleman. No. So let's see here. Now, I have already responded to some of them, but I thought I would do it more directly. So let's start here. 𝒮𝔴𝔞𝔤𝔤𝔢𝔯𝒮𝔮𝔲𝔞𝔮 says, the problem with this view is how can you hold anyone accountable for their action? For their actions? Is it moral to punish someone for something that is outside their control? Accountability implies free will. Scientifically, I don't think we have the tools to prove whether free will exists or not. We seem to get along if we pretend we have free will and are accountable for our choices. I'm okay with playing make-believe if it means living in a stable society with rules. And 𝒮𝔴𝔞𝔤𝔢𝔯𝒮𝔮𝔲𝔞𝔮 more, seemingly good points at first glance, but I'm afraid there's more than one fallacy here at play, which I've heard many times before, so don't feel too bad. So starting out, in terms of the accountability, you're absolutely right. There is no such thing as accountability. I don't think the concept makes sense, but I think it's important to separate two things, like make a clear distinction between what is physically true, in other words, what we scientifically can say makes sense, and how we live our lives. What I mean by that is, when I go down to the ice cream shop, just to take the generic example, and I look and I'm like, oh, I like raspberry sorbet and I like chocolate, but I can only afford one piece of ice cream because I'm a poor YouTuber, right? Then I feel like I have a choice. It's not like I'm living my life as if I don't. The important bits about this philosophy, which again we'll get into in more detail, is especially in our more dispassionate moments when we legislate. And take for example the country of Norway, just to not use my own country of Denmark, although I believe in large terms we have a similar philosophy in Scandinavia. Why do you think the return rates to prisons are so low in Scandinavia compared to, for example, the United States and many other places in the world? And the answer to that is really quite simple. It's because it's not about the punishment. Like, I'm not speaking to you directly now, but how sadistic a view is it to be under the impression that the suffering of another person rectifies the suffering he's already caused? That's just not, that makes no sense. Like, it literally makes no sense. The important thing, and I think what the point you're trying to bring up here is how do we structure society without having some form of accountability, right? Of course we need accountability, but accountability is really only a veil. It's an illusion. And that doesn't mean we should throw away the concept, but when you realize there's no such thing as free will, which, by the way, again, scientifically, there's no argument for whatsoever. When you say here that we don't have the tools to prove whether or not free will exists, well, that's no different from saying we don't have the tools to prove whether or not God exists. That's literally all that means. You're absolutely right. We can't prove that God doesn't exist, because if it doesn't, then you can't prove a negative. But there's no good reason to believe that it does exist, which is completely separate. As for how we structure our judicial system in terms of accountability and such, it is entirely logical, even without accountability in my view, to lock up dangerous people. Why is that? It's not for the sake of the punishment. There are two aspects. First of all, the sort of threat of the punishment also has a preventive effect to some degree. Like, I don't think that just increasing the punishment necessarily stacks equally with the prevention, as shown very clearly by a country like the United States. No offense, but there certainly is a sort of an idea that okay, we don't want to get punished, so it will prevent some measure of crime as opposed to having no punishment at all. But I think the empathetic thing, and as well as the logical thing, as well as the logically economic thing even, is to look at prisons and the judicial system not in forms of punishment, but in forms of how, like, can we or can we not take this individual and make them a productive member of society again. So you have some amount of punishment that should, but part of that punishment should be a method by which you try to help this person who's been unlucky in life get reintegrated into society. Why does that make sense? Well, it makes sense because to lock people up for life also costs, like it's suffering on their side. It costs the taxpayers a buttload of money, right? Whereas rehabilitating the person means you will then later on get a return on the investment you put for having this person in place, right? That requires staff, it requires food, it requires a living space, it requires a bunch of things, right? But you're going to get that return on investment back to society if you can produce a future tax-paying person who in the future is reintroduced into society in a condition in which he's able to get a job and live a normal life. And I'm not saying you can do that in every case, okay? That's why, like, there are psychopaths that exist, and there are people that should definitely be in medical facilities for the rest of their lives, not because we want to put them there, but because we simply have to realize that this person, if we reintroduce them into society, is gonna kill people, right? It's a danger to the well-being of the greater society at large. But it's not because we want to punish him. That's the thing. That's why I feel like the view of responsibility is so sadistic. And I know most people probably didn't think about this, so I'm not saying that you are sadistic for thinking so. Don't conflate the two. But just think about it. How does that make any sense at all? The compassionate view of no free will is that ultimately you aren't really responsible in the sense of the word for your actions. It also means you, that as I talked about yesterday, that the feeling of pride makes no sense either. And so where does that really leave us? Because again, there's a very big distinction to make between the first person perspective and the third person. What I mean by that is, let's say you're a mother, right? Someone killed your daughter. I'm not expecting that mother to be dispassionate having just lost her daughter. We're emotional creatures. Where we need to be dispassionate, where we need to be objective about the reality of nature, is when we legislate, okay? It's when we legislate. And to be under the assumption that because you were wronged by another person, you now have the right for them to suffer, if that is how you're thinking, then I'm sorry, then I don't know, then I don't know what to do with you. I'm like I get that again, in the first person moment, you feel like, oh, that rage, but that should worry you. That's an emotion. That doesn't make sense. That's not the compassionate view. The view should be, how do we better society? How do we progress society? How do we make a better world for as many people as possible? And in that sense, it should not be about the punishment. That doesn't mean there should be no punishment. Because of course, as far as, at least in our current society, we need punishment of some form, right? It should be humane, but I totally get that a prison system has to function, right? We sometimes, there has to be a deterrent, and we can't have every single person walking the streets. But the long-term goal should not be for the sake of punishment. That makes no sense. And let me give you let's go back to the comments real quick. I have a story I want to tell you guys that I didn't mention last night that puts it a bit more into perspective here. So _Mink shouldn't get punished for her actions if she didn't make any of the decisions that led to her whole debate off rails. How can we hold her responsible? She's as much a victim of circumstances as the mink. She is, yes. Like again, in my philosophy, you didn't choose your genes. You didn't choose the society in which you were born. You didn't choose whether or not you were molested as a child. All of these things are outside your control, which is why I think what we need to give up is not the feeling of free will, because I'm hopelessly incapable of not feeling like it's under my control when I decide what video to make today, right? That feels like a decision. If you don't decide to write a book, then you're not going to publish a book. Period, end of story, right? But it's also entirely possible within that view to say, but from an actual scientific, more objective perspective, if we take a step back, and then another step back perhaps, and to then realize that whether or not that was really your doing doesn't seem to make sense. It simply doesn't map on to the universe we know we live in. Okay, there is no piece of evidence anywhere that I've ever come across that gives even the slightest notion of a hint of a mechanism that can fall under the umbrella of what most people mean when they say free will, which is not freedom of choice. That's a different thing. Again, like if you have a gun to your head and someone tells you to do something, you could argue, well, you're not really free to do that. But let's keep going here. I support this content, whether someone is talking about something they're really passionate about. It usually makes for good videos. I'm glad to hear that, my friend. Oh yeah, more philosophical content on this channel would be great. I thank you, man. I really appreciate that. I think decision more mental in terms of physical. Like you can say in every situation, there's no choice, and you're always going to choose the same, even if you repeat this 100 times. But for me, it sounds just not right perspective. People making decisions depending on their knowledgeable character and other ill circumstances and conditions. And of course, in this moment, it's going to be the same because nothing changed at all. It's like throwing a ball in the same pit over and over and waiting for him to go somewhere else. Maybe I don't get it. Well, I'm afraid to say, 𝒮𝔴𝔞𝔤𝔢𝔯𝔮𝔲𝔞𝔡, I think you're absolutely right. So the thing is, where is the freedom of choice if you were going to do the same in every, like if you just click the play button and you were always going to choose right, then where's the freedom of choice? That doesn't mean it didn't feel like you had a choice. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't act in this world as if you have a choice. Again, like I said, if you don't decide to go write a book, well, then chances are the book's not going to get published, right? So again, I remember a quote from Stephen Hawking where he said, like, where he was talking against the notion of there not being free will. Like he believed in free will, and he's one of my greatest sort of my heroes, Stephen Hawking. My mom used to read his book to me when I was like 9 or 10 years old, Stephen Hawking's Universe, and I had the great pleasure of seeing him in person towards the end of his life. But he used to say something along the lines of that the people who don't believe in free will still seem to look to their sides before crossing the road, which is a clever way to put it, but nonetheless not really an argument, because you could still say that, well, any universe in which you didn't look before crossing the road seems like a way more likely universe in which to get hit by a car. So that's not really an argument, although Stephen Hawking, you are a clever man, and rest in peace, my friend. Yeah, I think most of these sort of controversial ones. Had a good bit of discussion here with Rust as well. But I want to tell you guys a story, okay? Now, a bit like yesterday's story, I'm winging it, so I don't recall the exact specifics, but the specifics aren't important. This is a way to contextualize a lot of my arguments into something that maybe seems more easier to grasp, right? Because I know these are difficult topics, okay? It took me... This is not some grand conclusion I suddenly came to the last Tuesday, right? Like, this is something... Like, I was firmly in the free will is a thing camp, at least until I was 18 or 19, where I hadn't really thought about it much until then, right? It was a period of 2 to 3 years over which I watched a bunch of lectures, read a bunch of books by, among others, Sam Harris, and a bunch of other neuropsychologists. And I just, from the physical background that I have, I just had to come to the conclusion that this makes no sense. It literally doesn't map onto the universe. And let me give you this analogy here. So, I believe in the United States. Don't know when. I have no idea when. But there was a mass murderer, right? But before he was a mass murderer, he was a doctor or fireman. I actually don't remember, but that doesn't matter either. He was a doctor or fireman. Something like in the age of early 40s, late 30s, had a wife and I believe 2 kids. And he was, in everyone in the community, he was known as the nicest, like a nice person. He never had any prior incidences. Well, what's the word I'm looking for? He never performed any crimes before, right? He's always been a model citizen. And one day, he shoots and kills his wife and both his kids. Then he grabs an assault rifle and goes on a mass murdering spree. Police shoot and kill him after he managed to kill like 10, 20, maybe 30 people. I don't recall the number, but it was a lot of people, right? And they check his body, and on his body they found a note that asked police to please do an autopsy of his brain. And in the note he explained that he didn't know what was going on. He said that for the past year he just got more and more angry, and he didn't know why. He didn't understand why, but he said he was just getting more and more like infuriated, and he couldn't understand why, and he didn't mean to do any of these things, but he was just so like, oh, he was like he was in a frenzy, and he just couldn't, you know. He explained that, and so they did an autopsy of his brain, and they found that he had a tumor growing on his amygdala, a big brain tumor, pushing really hard on his amygdala, which is one of the places in the brain where your emotions, I don't want to say come from, but you know what I mean, right? And so you would think, knowing this story, like if you knew he had that brain tumor ahead of time, you'd say, well, now you almost feel bad for him, right? And I was like, oh, is he a victim? Is he? I mean, he did kill like 20 people, but he didn't mean to. The person you would have known a year ago would have never done any of these things. And here's a clear recognition that this man was a victim of circumstance, yet he killed 20 people. Where does that put your free will? Where? And sure, this seems like exculpatory, what's the word I'm looking for? Exculpatory circumstances, right? But I would argue this is just a special case where it's more graspable to see that, okay, here the circumstances were medical and thus very obvious to point out, right? That to some extent this man is a victim. He is unlucky to be a man who suddenly had a brain tumor that caused him to go into a frenzy and kill his family, right? How unlucky do you have to be? He didn't mean to do that. But I would argue that any given other case, it's just less obvious. But you are no more in control of the circumstances of your brain in any given moment than that man was. It feels like you are, but really you aren't. This is just a special case where aggression was put in a physical form of this tumor later in life. But really, you had no choice. If you were molested and like treated ill as a child and grow up to be a madman, you didn't choose to be a psychopath. Like, where's the choice in that? It's not there. And so the reason I think this is the most compassionate view, not to mention most accurate, is because there's no longer any reason to hate bad people. That doesn't mean we shouldn't lock them up. That doesn't mean we shouldn't stop them and prevent them from hurting others and hurting society. But there's no longer cause to hate them, because at the end of the day, a psychopath is pretty unlucky to be a psychopath if he ends up killing 5 people and has to spend the rest of his life in solitary confinement. I wouldn't want to be that guy. Like, I don't think it's I think most people who hurt other people, they don't have nice lives mentally. Like, regardless of their circumstances, I don't think it's a great existence. It tends to be angry people. And being angry, being frustrated, you're in a dark place. And if anything, I pity them. That doesn't mean we shouldn't lock them up if we have to. But anyways, that's how I view these things. So just thought I would share that with you guys. I hope this makes sense. And don't worry, more Vermintide coming tomorrow. I promise. Anyways, let me know down in the comments if it made more sense now. And as always, I love you guys. Stay awesome. Pizza.